The entire building had gone dark hours ago. Every floor of Hale Dynamics' 42 stories of glass and steel, worth more than most small nations, sat in silence. Its corridors emptied of the analysts and engineers and project managers who filled them by day. Security lights pulsed faintly at stairwell exits. Cleaning carts sat parked in the lobby, half their contents already distributed across the lower floors. Only one window on the entire building still burned with light, a single rectangle of amber near the top of the tower, visible from the street below like a lantern hung at the edge of the sky. Ethan Brooks noticed it every night. He always arrived at 11, signed in at the ground floor desk, nodded at the overnight guard, and began his circuit from the bottom up. He was 37 years old, quiet in the way that people sometimes mistake for simple, and he carried himself without hurry, through hallways that smelled of recycled air and expensive carpet. His uniform was clean and pressed. His cart never rattled. He had worked the night shift at Hale Dynamics for 2 years, and in that time he had become, to most of the people who occasionally glimpsed him, essentially invisible, a shape that moved through the building like weather, noticed only when absent. His colleagues on the cleaning crew liked him well enough but didn't know what to make of him. He rarely talked about himself. He brought food in a simple container, ate alone near a window during break, and read from a battered technical notebook whose pages were dense with handwriting that looked less like a personal journal and more like engineering schematics. Marcus, the overnight security guard, once peered over Ethan's shoulder while he was sketching something in the notebook and said, without particular malice, "Man, you're wasting yourself doing this job." Ethan had looked up, considered the comment as though it were a moderately interesting piece of data, and said only, "Maybe." Then he went back to writing. Marcus shook his head and decided Ethan was one of those people the world had briefly chewed on and spat out. The kind who carried something unspoken behind their eyes, and it wasn't his business to ask what. What Marcus did not know, what none of them knew, was that the notebook Ethan carried had once belonged to the laboratory desk of a man who had been, 8 years ago, considered one of the most promising software engineers in the country. The handwriting in its margins had drafted the first architecture of an AI-driven logistics system that 2 venture capital firms had fought over at a San Francisco pitch event. The man who had drawn those schematics had worn tailored suits and given talks at conferences, and co-founded a startup out of a rented office in Cambridge, with $30,000 and a college roommate who would later become his business partner. That man had a MIT degree in computer engineering, a name that appeared in industry publications, and a future that seemed to stretch forward without horizon. And then something happened. And then he became Ethan Brooks, the night janitor on floor 1 through 42, who ate alone and read his old notebook and said very little to anyone. The apartment he lived in was small and located in a neighborhood where the restaurants had paper menus taped to their windows. He paid his rent on time. He kept the space immaculate, as though cleanliness were a form of discipline he could not afford to relax. In the second bedroom, his mother slept with the help of 3 medications and a humidifier that ran all night. Her name was Ruth, and she had spent most of her adult life working as a school librarian before her health had begun its gradual, undramatic erosion. Ethan cooked for her before his shift. He left notes on the kitchen counter in case she woke in the night. He called her from the building stairwell during his break. And if she didn't answer, he called again. And this quiet ritual of vigilance was the architecture of his evenings. He was, by any practical measure, a man who had stripped his life down to its studs and found that what remained was still worth caring for. Meanwhile, on the 42nd floor of the same building, Victoria Hale was doing what she did every night, outrunning the hours. She was 34 years old and the youngest CEO in Hale Dynamics' history, a fact the press mentioned so frequently it had begun to feel less like praise and more like a warning. The business press called her the Iron Queen, a nickname she had never asked for and had learned to wear like armor anyway. She had built the company's AI division from a department of 8 engineers into the flagship of the entire enterprise, attracting government contracts, international partnerships, and a board of directors who smiled at her in meetings and discussed her future in private with the same calculating interest one gives a high-yield but volatile investment. She was brilliant, precise, and relentlessly composed, And she had learned very early that the people around her would use any visible crack in that composure as a crowbar. What those people did not see, because she did not allow them to see it, was the cost. She slept 4 hours most nights. She ate at her desk. She had not taken a vacation in 3 years and had declined to attend her college roommate's wedding because it conflicted with a product launch. She had no one in the building she would call a friend, only colleagues, allies, threats, and uncertainties. The AI platform that Hale Dynamics was preparing to release publicly was 18 months of compressed effort. And the stakes attached to its success were not abstract. They were board seats and stock valuations, and the jobs of 412 employees, and the particular, sharp-edged pride of a woman who had wagered everything on being right. And then the whispers had started. A project is only as strong as the people inside it. And something in the structure of hers had begun to rot. Employees spoke quietly in the corridors about irregularities in the development timeline. The financial modeling team had flagged 2 anomalies they couldn't reconcile. A coder on the back-end team mentioned, once, to a colleague, that certain access logs didn't add up, and that colleague mentioned it to someone else, and soon the building hummed with a low current of unease that everyone sensed and no one addressed directly. Ethan, pushing his cart through the 23rd floor at midnight, had heard the fragments without seeking them. He had learned that Daniel Mercer, Victoria's most trusted operational partner, was the one people spoke about with that particular hesitation that meant they didn't quite dare say what they were thinking. He filed this away without judgment, the way he filed most things, quietly, carefully. In a part of himself he rarely showed to anyone. On a Tuesday in November, at 11:47 in the evening, Ethan stepped into the elevator to the 42nd floor to retrieve the trash from the executive suite. The floor was rarely occupied this late, but the light was on, as it often was, and he'd been assigned to clean it twice a week regardless. The elevator doors opened onto a corridor of pale marble and recessed lighting, and the silence was so complete that when he stepped off the cart it seemed to fill the space with sound. He moved toward the main office, his cart ahead of him, and then he stopped. Because, through the heavy glass panel beside the closed office door, there was a sound that did not belong to an empty building. Glass breaking, something heavy hitting the floor, and beneath both of those, almost swallowed by them, the sound of someone crying, not freely, but with the pressed, controlled quality of someone who had decided they were allowed very little of it. Ethan stood still for a moment. He was not a man who reacted without thinking, and so he thought. He could leave the floor and come back later. He could knock once and confirm the suite was occupied and withdraw. He could pretend the sound hadn't carried to him through the glass. All of these were reasonable options, and he was aware of all of them, and then he opened the door anyway. Victoria Hale was on the floor. Not collapsed, she had arranged herself there. Or gravity had arranged her. Somewhere between those two things, sitting with her back against the front of her desk. Her legs pulled up, her heels against the polished wood floor, her suit jacket was off and folded over the arm of her chair, with a precision that suggested she'd taken it off before everything fell apart, not after. A laptop computer lay on the floor to her left, its screen cracked, the damage fresh. Papers were everywhere, financial documents, printed spreadsheets, something that looked like a contract, and many of them had been torn, not neatly, but in the way that happens when a person's hands need to do something that their voice cannot. Her eyes came up to Ethan's face, and what crossed her expression was not embarrassment first, or anger first, but something more primary, the shock of being seen in a moment she had built her entire career around never being seen in. Ethan did not back out of the room. He stood in the doorway and held very still. The way you hold still around something wounded that might bolt or bite if startled. "Get out," Victoria said. Her voice was controlled. The steadiness of it was extraordinary given what her face looked like. He didn't. He looked at the room, at the torn documents, the broken laptop, the way the papers had spread across the floor in a semicircle around her, like the debris field of a small explosion, and he read what he was seeing the way he read everything, systematically and without hurry. Then he walked to the small credenza along the far wall where the coffee machine sat, and he poured what was left in the carafe into a clean mug, and he set it on the edge of the desk near her, within reach but not pressed upon her. He did not sit down. He did not speak immediately. "I told you to leave," she said again, quieter. "I heard you," Ethan said. A long silence passed between them. The city glittered 42 floors below, indifferent and enormous. Victoria looked at the coffee mug, and something in her posture changed by a fraction of a degree, not softening exactly, but the specific tension of someone about to issue another command eased slightly, as though she had measured the cost of it, and found she didn't have the reserves. He spoke then, not looking at her but at the torn paper near his feet. "Sometimes the thing that breaks you isn't the failure itself." He paused. "It's the moment you realize someone you trusted was the one who built the failure." He didn't look up. That's a different kind of thing. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Victoria did not respond for a long time. And when she did, she said nothing. She simply picked up the mug and held it. And the fact of that small gesture said more than speech would have. Ethan collected the trash without ceremony, moved around the edges of the room, and left. But before he did, he looked back once. And for the first time in 2 years of walking invisible through this building, someone on the 42nd floor looked directly back at him, and genuinely seemed to register what they saw. The nights that followed were not dramatic in their beginning. They accumulated slowly, the way trust does when it is real. Not in one decisive moment, but in the layering of small, unremarkable ones. Victoria began staying later, which she had always done, but something shifted in what the lateness meant. Ethan continued his rounds, which he had always done, but on the nights he reached the 42nd floor, the door was sometimes slightly open rather than closed, and the atmosphere was different from an empty room. He began to stop, not for long, 5 minutes, 10. He would set his cart in the corridor and lean against the doorframe, and Victoria would be at her desk or at the window, and they would talk not about strategy or work, not at first, but about smaller things that were actually larger things underneath. She said, one night, that she had not spoken to her mother in 3 weeks because every conversation became an argument about whether she was working too hard, and she didn't have the energy to both work hard and also perform the reassurance that she wasn't. Ethan said he understood that particular mathematics. She looked at him for a moment, and then looked away, as though the directness of being understood made her uncomfortable. Another night he told her that the pressure of standing at the top of something is strange, because it looks like power from below. But from where you're standing, it mostly feels like exposure. She was quiet after that, in the way that people are quiet when something has named a thing they hadn't found words for. He was careful and measured in everything he said, precise without being cold. And this was not performance, it was simply the way he organized information, including emotional information. Victoria was a woman who had spent years surrounded by people whose every statement carried an agenda, and Ethan had no agenda visible anywhere on him. He didn't want her job. He didn't want her attention or her connections or her approval, as far as she could tell. He just spoke plainly, and listened the way few people listened, not waiting for a turn to speak, but actually attending. "You talk about systems a lot," she said one evening, watching him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Tech systems. Like you actually understand them." He didn't answer immediately. "You're not just a janitor," she said. It wasn't entirely a question. "I clean buildings," he said. "That's what I do." "That's not the same as what you are." The conversation ended there. Not because the question was deflected, but because neither of them was ready yet for what would come next. But it had been asked, and it hung between them. And in the following nights, Victoria began to notice more carefully the way he traced a problem with his hands when he talked, the geometric precision of his thinking, the instinctive way he had once, on his way past a broken diagnostic display in the hallway, corrected a setting without breaking stride, in under 30 seconds, a fix that the facilities team had scheduled for the following week. What she did not yet know was where all of it came from. What she had not yet been given was the weight behind the composure, the thing that had turned a gifted engineer into a man who swept floors at midnight, and lived in a small apartment, and called his mother from stairwells. But she was beginning to suspect that the answer, when she found it, would be the kind that changes the shape of everything that came before it. There was a night in the third week when she asked him, almost experimentally, why he thought the most talented people were often the least visible ones in any organization. He thought about it before answering, which she had already come to expect. He never filled silence with words just to fill it. He said he thought visibility was a form of currency, and like most currencies, the people who accumulated the most of it were not always the ones who had earned it through the hardest work, but through the most strategic positioning. He said the people who were genuinely absorbed in solving problems rarely had the bandwidth left over to also manage how they appeared to the people watching. He said he wasn't sure whether that was a flaw in institutions or just an accurate description of how human attention worked. Victoria listened, and she thought about every performance review she had ever conducted and felt the discomfort of someone who has just been handed a mirror at an unflattering angle. She did not tell him that, but she thought about it for days afterward, in meetings, in the elevator, at her desk, the particular discomfort of a fair criticism absorbed quietly. His brother's name had been Nathan. Younger by 4 years, the easygoing one, the one who played guitar and made people laugh and never took himself too seriously in the way Ethan always had. When the startup was gaining traction, and Ethan was working 18-hour days, and Nathan had called twice to say he wanted to visit. Ethan had put it off once because of a product deadline, once because of investor meetings. He had put it off until the call came from a hospital in Connecticut on a Saturday morning, a car accident on a wet road, and Nathan was gone before Ethan could reach him. The company had gone on, the investors had gone on, the product had shipped on schedule, and Ethan had walked away from all of it, not in a dramatic gesture but in a quiet, terminal recognition that he had confused motion for living for so long that he had missed the things that were actually his life until they were gone. He did not speak of this often, or at all, and the years since had been his own particular form of penance, not self-destruction, but self-erasure, the deliberate narrowing of ambition to fit inside a grief he was still learning to carry. The crisis, when it broke into the open, broke loudly. A financial news outlet published a story on a Thursday morning, citing anonymous sources, claiming that proprietary AI architecture from Hale Dynamics had appeared in a competing firm's newly filed patents. The story used words like catastrophic breach and alleged insider involvement in questions about leadership. By the time the market opened, the company's stock had shed 11% of its value. By noon, 3 board members had sent terse messages to Victoria, requesting an emergency meeting. By 3 in the afternoon, Daniel Mercer had appeared in multiple press interviews presenting himself as a man deeply shocked by the allegations, and deeply committed to getting to the truth, a posture so fluent and rehearsed that it was itself the answer to every question about his guilt. Victoria did not sleep that week. She moved through the building on pure adrenaline and institutional pride, meeting after meeting, statement after statement, her composure in public so absolute that people assumed she was fine, which was its own form of loneliness. The board made clear, without quite saying it directly, that they believed the problem was her, that she was too young, that she had trusted too easily, that the company needed steadier hands at the top. Danielle, who had been the person she trusted most, who had sat across from her in 100 planning sessions and shared her vision and her frustration and her ambition, had sold her architecture to a competitor for money she could not yet calculate. The intimacy of that betrayal was the thing she couldn't put down. Ethan saw it all from the edges. He watched her from corridors and elevator lobbies, from the angle of someone who does not belong to the world they're observing, but can see it more clearly for the distance. And he saw something else. Something that nagged at him with the specific insistence of a technical problem that has a solution the user hasn't found yet. The breach had characteristics. The way the data had been extracted, the particular architecture that had been compromised, the timing of the access logs, as described in the press reporting all of it, pointed to someone with very specific system privileges, privileges that existed only at the most senior levels. Daniel had those privileges. But the pattern of the breach, the redundancy, the layering, the way certain evidence had been preemptively obscured, suggested either extraordinary foresight from one person or the participation of more than one. Ethan had read enough about the company's system architecture, in the fragments of documentation he'd come across over 2 years of cleaning the building after hours, to feel the shape of something that hadn't been said publicly yet. He was standing near the server room on the 31st floor, having delivered cleaning supplies to a closet down the hall, when he found himself looking at a printed network diagram someone had left on a table and never retrieved. He picked it up. He studied it for 3 minutes. He put it back exactly where he'd found it and continued his rounds, but the shape he'd felt had sharpened into something specific. The following evening, it was Victoria who sought him out, not the other way around. She found him on the 28th floor, came around a corner he wasn't expecting her on, and said, without preamble, "I saw you looking at the network diagram last night." There was no accusation in her voice, but there was something watchful, the focused attention of someone who has learned to trust nothing and is deciding whether to make an exception. Ethan met her eyes. He said, calmly, "The access pattern in the breach report doesn't match what a single actor with Daniel Mercer's clearance level could do alone. There's a second point of entry, the timestamps on the server-side logs. If you look at the 15-minute window between 2 and 3 in the morning on 3 specific dates, don't align with the access records Daniel would have generated. Someone with board-level override access opened a secondary door and then manually falsified the primary log to make it look like the intrusion was simpler than it was." Victoria stared at him. The particular quality of the silence was one he recognized. It was the silence of someone recalibrating. "How do you know what board-level override access looks like?" she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Because I designed the original security architecture," he said. "Before you bought the company, there are moments in which a conversation pivots on a single sentence, and the air changes. This was one of them." Victoria said nothing for a long stretch, and Ethan waited, which he was good at. Then she said, "Tell me everything." He did. Not that night. That night she only began to understand the surface of it, the outline of Ethan Brooks, former founder, former engineer, former promising name in a field that had moved on without him. But she gave him limited access to the internal system logs, a quiet arrangement made after hours on a company tablet she erased the history from, and Ethan began to work. He worked the way he had once worked in a different life, methodically, without ego, following the logic of the problem, wherever it led. He sat in darkened offices on floors above the server rooms and analyzed data in the hours when the building was at its most still. Twice he nearly triggered security protocols by accessing restricted nodes. Both times he navigated out before the alarm completed. Once, at 3 in the morning, a member of the facilities team came through unexpectedly, and Ethan sat motionless behind an equipment rack for 6 minutes before the footsteps receded. He noted his own heartbeat was steady throughout, and found it interesting that after years of enforced quiet, his body had lost the habit of panic. The data did not lie, and it did not withhold. Data had always been this way for Ethan, cooperative in the specific way that problems are cooperative when you approach them without preconception, without needing a particular answer. He looked at what was there, not at what the press narrative or Daniel's public posture suggested should be there. And this distinction was the entire difference. The falsified timestamps had been overlaid with a degree of technical sophistication that would have fooled most forensic analysts working from the surface level of the records. But the falsification itself required overwriting a base layer log that only the original architecture's designer would know existed, a failsafe Ethan had built into the system 8 years ago as a backup auditing mechanism, nested 2 levels below the standard access records, the kind of thing that existed precisely because the people who designed security systems knew that someday someone would try to corrupt the visible layer and never suspect that something was watching underneath. He had built it as a ghost. Now the ghost had a story to tell. He found what he was looking for on the 9th night. The secondary access point was not Daniel's. The falsified logs pointed back to a board member specifically, to a man named Raymond Carr, who sat on the compensation committee and had been positioning himself for months, quietly and through proxies, to orchestrate a forced sale of the AI division to a competitor in which he held a significant undisclosed interest. Daniel had been his instrument. The technology had been the product. Victoria's reputation was supposed to be the collateral damage that made the whole arrangement possible and clean. He went to Victoria at midnight and told her what he had found. And she sat very still across the table from him in her darkened office and listened to all of it. When he finished, she looked at the window, at the city, for a long time. The night before the shareholder meeting, she had already printed the resignation letter. It sat in the top drawer of her desk, already signed. The city below them was what it always was at this hour, tireless and glittering, its million windows lit by people doing things she would never know about, their particular dramas and decisions and small defeats invisible from 42 floors up. She had looked at this view more times than she could count. And it had always meant one thing to her: scale, reach, the size of the enterprise below her that she was responsible for. Tonight it meant something else. Tonight it looked like all the people she had never made time to know. All the conversations she had abbreviated. All the calls she had put off. It looked like Nathan, who she did not know about yet, but whose shape she could sense in Ethan's silences, in the way he moved around the edges of his own story, without quite entering it. She was beginning to understand that the composure she had always read as self-possession was actually something older and more specific, the composure of a person who has learned to hold grief in a stable position, which is not the same as having let it go. She told him that night, what she had not told anyone, that she had built the company into what it was partly to fill a space that she had never quite named, that the drive had never been purely ambition in the way people assumed, but something close to running, though from what she could not have said precisely, she said she was tired, not physically, though she was that too tired in the way that means a person has been spending from the principal, and not the interest, and has only recently checked the account. He listened without interrupting, without offering solutions, and when she finished he was quiet for long enough that the silence felt respectful rather than empty. He told her about Nathan then, quietly, without preamble. The way the dates had overlapped: the investor meeting, the product deadline, the unanswered calls, the hospital parking lot, the drive home alone. He did not editorialize or explain what he had done with the grief afterward. She could see the shape of it plainly and what his life had become. And he trusted her to see it, which was itself a thing he had not trusted anyone with in a very long time. When he finished, neither of them spoke for several minutes, and the city went on below them, and the silence between them had the quality of two people who have finally arrived at the same room from very different directions, and are taking a moment to register that they are both actually there. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. She asked it simply, without calculation, in the way she was only beginning to learn to ask things. He considered the question, which was the real question beneath all the other questions they had been circling around. "Because I know what it feels like," he said, "to lose everything. And I know what it looks like when the reason for it isn't what everyone thinks." He paused. "And because I had the ability to help, and chose not to use it a long time ago. And I've thought about that a lot." She looked at him then, not in the way she looked at analysts whose proposals she was evaluating, or board members she was managing, or journalists she was navigating. She looked at him the way you look at someone who has said an entirely true thing, and whose truthfulness is the unsettling part. He pulled the resignation letter from the drawer before she could, and he set it on the credenza, and he said, "Tell me your presentation runs 45 minutes and starts at 9. She nodded. He said, "Then we have 9 hours. She reached over and, without ceremony, tore the letter in half. The shareholder meeting began at 9 in the morning in the conference center on the 39th floor, with 67 shareholders and board members present, 2 journalists who had been granted access as observers, and Daniel Mercer in a charcoal suit that had cost more than Ethan's monthly rent, seated near the front with the settled confidence of a man who expects to win. Victoria stood at the podium looking precisely, as she always did in public, composed, precise, in command of whatever room she was in, and worked through the first 20 minutes of the meeting as though it were any other morning, which confused Daniel, which was the point. He had prepared remarks about leadership accountability. He had assembled 3 board members who were prepared to second his motion for an emergency leadership review. He had a narrative and a calendar and an exit strategy. and he had expected to deploy all of it by 10:15 at the latest. The conference room door opened at 9:42. Ethan walked in wearing his cleaning uniform, pushing his cart slightly ahead of him, and the room reacted the way a room reacts to the completely unexpected, a beat of total silence, and then a murmur that moved from the back forward. Daniel looked up, registered who he was looking at, and let a slow and contemptuous smile open across his face. He said something to the man beside him, quietly, and both of them almost laughed, and this was the last mistake Daniel Mercer would make in that building. "I'd like to introduce Ethan Brooks," Victoria said from the podium, her voice unchanged. "Who is going to share a brief presentation?" Ethan walked to the AV panel at the side of the room. He connected his tablet. He pulled up the first slide, which showed a network architecture diagram with his name in the document's original metadata dated 8 years ago. The year the AI foundation the entire company was now built on had been designed. The room changed again, in a different direction. Several people leaned forward. Daniel stopped, almost laughing. What followed was 15 minutes of the clearest, most technically precise and legally damning presentation that anyone in that room would see in their careers. Ethan spoke without hurry and without performance. The way he did everything, walking through the access logs and the timestamp falsifications and the secondary entry point and the financial arrangements that connected Raymond Carr to the competing firm. He had documentation. He had recovered data that had been imperfectly deleted imperfectly, because the person who deleted it hadn't understood the depth of the recovery tools available to someone who had built the original system. He had transaction records. He had emails between Daniel and Carr that had been archived on a server both of them believed was inaccessible. Daniel rose from his chair at minute 11 and said, loudly, that this was a fabrication, a desperate act by a failed CEO using a plant to muddy legitimate governance proceedings, and his voice had a quality in it that the room heard clearly, not the quality of a man defending himself against false accusations, but the quality of a man whose prepared narrative had just been taken apart in front of 67 people who had the power to act on what they were hearing. 2 shareholders had already pulled out their phones. 1 board member had gone pale. Raymond Carr was very still in his chair in a way that drew more attention than movement would have. Daniel took 3 steps toward Ethan, and his face had moved through outrage into something less controlled, and the head of building security, who had been standing near the door, stepped forward and placed himself between them, and Daniel stopped, not because he wanted to, but because the mathematics of the moment had shifted irrevocably, and some part of him understood that. He sat down. He said nothing else. When the police arrived 22 minutes later, called by the building's legal counsel, who had begun making calls from the hallway during minute 7 of the presentation, Daniel Mercer stood and walked out between 2 officers with a composure that everyone in the room could see was the very last thing he left. Raymond Carr followed 4 minutes after. A quieter departure, the kind made by someone who has decided that dignity is still an option if he doesn't resist. The room was silent for a long moment after the doors closed. Then one of the shareholders began to applaud, and it moved through the room in a wave, and Victoria stood at the podium looking out at 67 people making noise, and she allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to feel the relief of something having gone the right way. The weeks after the meeting were a different kind of chaos, the productive kind, the kind that means things are actually being repaired. The press cycle reversed itself with remarkable speed, which is the nature of press cycles, and Hale Dynamics became a story of resilience and transparency rather than corruption, which served everyone's interests, including the shareholders. The stock recovered, and then exceeded its previous high. The legal process moved forward. Victoria gave 2 interviews in which she spoke about accountability and institutional trust, and she did so with a clarity that felt earned rather than performed, because it was. She also, for the first time, spoke in those interviews about the people inside the building who did not make the organizational chart: the maintenance crew, the overnight staff, the workers who kept the infrastructure of the enterprise functioning, while the people on the upper floors took credit for the whole. The journalists found this interesting and a little unusual, and printed it with the mild surprise of people who have not heard a CEO say such a thing in a way that did not seem performative. It was not performative. She meant every word, and the people in the building who read it knew the difference. Ethan came to her office one evening after the building had quieted and told her he was thinking of leaving. He said it simply, without drama, in the way he said most things. "I don't belong in this world," he said. "I made peace a long time ago with the one I chose." He meant the apartment with his mother, the quiet nights, the notebooks, the life stripped to its essentials, not a failure, but a deliberate thing, chosen in grief, and maintained in something that had slowly become acceptance. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Then she went home. And she did something she hadn't done in years. She read. She found his name in 5-year-old publications, 8-year-old conference proceedings, a profile in a technology magazine that described him as someone to watch, that used the word generational about his potential. She read about the startup and the early funding and the sudden disappearance from the industry that no one at the time had an explanation for. She put her phone down at 1 in the morning, and she thought about the gap between what she had known of him, the quiet man with the cart, the invisible one, and what she now knew, which was that he had never been invisible at all, only that the people looking had never learned how to see. She went to his apartment on a Saturday. It was in a neighborhood she had never had reason to be in, and the building was old and clean and small. She knocked, and when the door opened, she saw past him into a kitchen where a woman she understood to be his mother was sitting at a table with a cup of tea and a crossword puzzle, comfortable in the unhurried way of someone being well cared for. The apartment itself was immaculate and unadorned. There were books on a low shelf. The notebook was on the kitchen counter. There was nothing performing wealth or ambition or anything other than the life of a man who had decided what mattered and organized his space around it. Victoria stood in the doorway for a moment, and something moved through her that she had no precise category for, not pity, not admiration exactly, but a recognition of something she had not encountered before, which was that this was what it looked like when a person was genuinely free of the things she spent all her time accumulating and protecting. She felt, in the most uncomfortable way, that she was the one who was poor. They walked around the block, and the morning was gray and cool, and she said to him, "Finally, you never failed. You just stopped running in the direction everyone expected." He said nothing to that. But he didn't disagree. She said, "I'd like you to consult, not as a title, not publicly, on your terms." He asked what that meant, and she said it meant he would have access, and a room, and the ability to say no to anything at any time, and she would pay him fairly, and she would not turn him into a story she was telling about herself. He thought about it for a block and a half. Then he said yes. The building was different after that, not dramatically, not in ways visible on an organizational chart, but in the ways that matter. Victoria's leadership changed in register, not softer exactly, but more dimensional, more attentive to the texture of the people inside the enterprise, rather than just their output. She held smaller meetings and listened longer in them. She remembered names. She stopped treating the gap between executive floors and maintenance corridors as a natural fact rather than a choice someone had made. The employees noticed. People who had worked at Hale Dynamics for years said privately that the place felt different, that something had shifted in the atmosphere, and no one could identify precisely what, which is how it usually goes when a culture actually changes. Ethan came in 3 days a week. He kept his own hours. He sat in a small office on the 21st floor, without the glass walls and marble surfaces of the executive suite, and when people brought him problems, he solved them with the same unhurried precision he had always had, and they began to understand that the lack of title was not a deficit, but a choice, and they respected the choice. He smiled more than he used to. He was occasionally heard laughing in the hallway. His mother's health stabilized, and on some weekends he played chess with Marcus, the security guard, in the lobby, and he let Marcus win about half the time. And Marcus suspected this, but couldn't prove it. One evening, after a planning session ran long, and the building had emptied around them, they sat at the small table in her office with takeout containers, and the city spread below them, and Victoria said, without looking up, "I called my mother today." She said it simply, as though it were a small thing, but it was not a small thing, and both of them knew it. Ethan said, "How was she?" Victoria smiled, just slightly. She said, "I sound different. Lighter." She paused. "I didn't know it was something anyone could hear." He looked at her across the table, and he said, "It's something I could hear." She met his eyes, and something that had been building quietly for months arrived at its conclusion between them, and neither of them looked away. The dinner after that was the first one that was clearly not about work. It happened on a Thursday, in a restaurant that was not expensive but was very good, chosen by Ethan, who knew the neighborhood and had opinions about noodles. They talked about his brother, which he had not talked about with anyone in years, and she listened in the way he had once listened to her fully, without agenda, and when he finished, she did not say she was sorry in the reflexive way people say it, but only nodded, and the nod said what it needed to say. She told him about the first board meeting she had ever run, age 29, and how she had worn a suit 2 sizes too large because she thought it would make her look more serious, and how she could still feel the shoulders drooping, and how she had delivered the entire presentation holding herself unnaturally rigid to keep the jacket in place, and he laughed, and she laughed at herself laughing, and the evening moved forward in that way. He took her hand at the end of the night. Not dramatically. His hand opened on the table near hers, an offering rather than a claim, and she looked at it and then placed her hand in it. And the gesture was as quiet and as certain as everything else about him. A year later, Hale Dynamics held its annual stakeholder event in a hall downtown, and the room was full of investors and partners and industry journalists, and the energy was the kind that belongs to a company that has emerged from something difficult and become more itself on the other side. Victoria stood at the podium in a room of 400 people and said what she had to say about the year, and the numbers, and the future, and then she set down her prepared remarks and said something that was not in them. She said, "There is a person in this room who saved this company. Not a billionaire, not a celebrity technologist, not a consultant we hired, or a law firm we retained. Someone who most of you, including me, walked past for 2 years without once really seeing. Someone who could have done nothing, and had every reason to do nothing, and chose to show up anyway, not for a reward, not for a title, not for recognition, just because it was the right thing to do and he had the ability to do it." She paused, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are when they understand something true has been said. "The person who taught me what this company should be," she said, "is someone most of us never learned to look at." The camera at the back of the room found him a man in a well-cut but simple jacket, sitting 3 rows from the back, not in the reserved section at the front. He looked, as he always did, entirely at ease. The room stood. It happened the way real things happen, not in a choreographed wave but in ones and twos, until the whole space was on its feet, and the sound of it filled the hall, and Ethan sat in it for a moment, and then rose, briefly, because not rising would have been impolite, and nodded once, simply, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was something more difficult to name, a man recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that what he had carried for years was not a debt unpaid but a life lived differently than expected. And that different was not the same as wrong. Victoria stepped down from the stage, moving through the crowd, and found him at the end of his row, and she took his hand, and they stood together while the room went on making noise around them, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to explain. Later that evening, walking back through the glass lobby of the building, Ethan stopped and looked up at the tower rising above them into the cold, clear sky. He stood there for a moment, and the building that had once been simply the place where he worked, then the place that had tested him, then the place where something in him had come back to life, stood exactly as it always had, enormous and indifferent, and lit from within. He had walked into it every night for 2 years, as a man who had decided to make himself invisible. He had walked out of it changed, and he had changed something in it, and these 2 facts were the same fact, and he knew it. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he smiled. Not the practiced, careful expression he kept ready for the world. The real one, unguarded, quiet, certain, the smile of a man who had lost everything, and found that what he'd lost was not what he'd thought, and that what he still carried was more than enough. He had walked into this building as a ghost. He was leaving it as himself, and he understood, standing in the cold air of that lobby, that those 2 things had never actually been different, that he had been himself all along, even in the quiet years, even in the invisible ones, waiting with a patience that looked like surrender but was actually something closer to faith. Sometimes, the person who changes your life most completely is the one the world never learned to look at, and sometimes the work that matters most is done at midnight, in the dark, by someone no one thought to thank. The world keeps moving, and the buildings stay lit, and somewhere in the city, a man walks home to his mother and his notebook and his small, clean apartment, and he carries with him the knowledge that the life he almost gave up on had been, all along, exactly enough.